I think a lot of problems that decision makers run into is that their KPIs are based on what turnover or what revenue are you going to bring in the next 12 months, as opposed to what are you going to bring in 20 years down the track.
As you can tell by my beanie, a fever has taken over the country, and its number one symptom is the smell of jasmine in the air. No, it's not a wave of COVID, but that could definitely be the case. But footy fever that I'm talking about. In the northern states, Rugby League is reigniting its state v state competitiveness as North Queensland and Penrith, both regional outlets I might just want to add, have progressed to the penultimate stage, whilst in the southern states where we reside, one eye is on who will win the big dance come this Saturday, whilst the other is surveying whether the Apple Eye will get an invite to the party at all. The slow burn narrative of 2022, in AFL circles at least, was whether Tasmania would be presented with the opportunity to host the 19th club in the Australian Football League. And with the bid formally being presented to the Afl Commission and the club presidents today, Monday the 19th of September, I'm joined by Senior Associate James Fitzpatrick and Associate Sabrine Navarro to analyse what we know about the bid so far and to explain Michelson Alexander's approach to the various strategic communications and engagement plan needs of the major stakeholders involved in this important decision for the country's biggest professional sporting organisation. Thank you for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So, first off, the big question I think for most people listening, especially if you're not a sports buff, is why do we care? And this came from Deputy Labor Leader of Tasmania, Anita Dow, in response to the costings, which are around about $100 million for a 10-year commitment and a further $50 million up front before we even involved the stadium. So her response was, we're in the midst of a health, housing and cost of living crisis, and this government needs to do more to get the basics right for Tasmanians. So with that in mind, Sabrine, what do football sporting organisations give back to the community that warrants such an upfront expense?
I think apart from the obvious answer, which would be entertainment, I think sporting clubs offer a lot more. And I want to break this down into a few things, which is the first being opportunity. And opportunity in that it offers a lot of pathways for locals and the community. I know that I've experienced AFL players coming to my primary school when I was a kid, and being able to shake their hand, kick a footy with them was just an amazing experience, and does a lot for what I wanted to aspire to when I wanted to grow up, and how I wanted to play my football, be an athlete.
I couldn't agree more with Sabrine there. Like, it's so clear the role that sporting clubs in Australia play for Australia's social and cultural fabric. And I'm glad that the Deputy Labor Leader in Tassie pulled out the point about, well, hang on, we're in the midst of a health, housing and cost of living crisis here. Because I think sporting clubs actually have a role to addressing some of those social issues that we've got. And they've done this for many decades in Australia. And for some of the reasons that Sabrine's just outlined then, they provide a pathway for people, they connect to different cultures and communities, they actually bring money in as well. Like, yes, local sport does require some investment, but they also bring in a lot of money through a whole number of avenues like tourism. But the last example comes out, and I'll use an anecdote to tell this story, but a while back, Gordon and I had an opportunity to travel around to a lot of sporting clubs across rural Australia, and we went to one particular one that's just across the Victorian-New South Wales border in New South Wales, called Finley, and there the local football and netball club had played such an important role in that town, particularly through the Australian drought. And what we found was that sporting clubs and the local football and netball clubs in these small regional towns had taken on the role of the church. So for many years in Australian society, the church was your common meeting place for the community. It was where people went on a weekend to get together, to swap stories, to sort of build up that social, cultural cohesion of the community. And that was almost their mental health, their mental well-being outlet. And, we've seen over many decades that the church in Australia has declined for a variety of reasons. But what we found in those towns is that the local football and netball club, and the same goes for other sports, became the new meeting point for that community. So on a Thursday night at the football and netball training, that's where the whole town, even if they weren't playing or if they didn't have kids playing, they would come and they would have a meal together after training, or they'd be there on Saturday for game day, and the whole community got out. And that was a real relief during that drought period of drought where a lot of families were experiencing significant financial distress, not too dissimilar to the cost of living to today, albeit in different formats, significant mental health issues throughout regional Australia. And a lot of them were being addressed through the support of the football and netball club. And you've seen that, anyone that's been involved in those sporting clubs will have similar stories on different topics. And I think for that reason, that is one of the critical reasons why we've got to support the growth of sport across Australia and support its role in providing health and social cohesion to communities all across the nation.
And I suppose even above and beyond that, the events element of something like this has been highlighted as well by the Premier of the Tasmanian State Government in a justification for these initial outlays. Is basically that it creates a precinct, it creates a reason for people to come visit our state, but also it creates a reason for our state to feel equal to the rest of Australia. His kind of response to that comment was basically like, Tasmania can't keep saying no to things because we have problems. We will fix our problems. We'll fix our issues that we're currently facing and do these things on top of and be a bit more aspirational with our activities. So that's kind of been the story of this bid. If you go back through its history, Tasmania has been an aspirational state. It has a long and strong, proud AFL or Australian rules football history. And since about 1990, it's been trying to get its own AFL team for various reasons. And then it missed out on an expansion time in the late 2008 when Gold Coast and DWS were introduced, and now have been experimenting with these home games between Hawthorn and North Melbourne to see if there was an appetite for people to come and travel to Tasmania, which there is. The Cutter report was released last year in 2021, and on the back of that, they are submitting their final submission for the Tasmanian AFL licence bid today in 2022. But with such a complex history preceding all of this bid, James, how would you think that we at Michelson Alexander would go about approaching the strategic communication needs and the engagement plan needs of such a complex and large bid?
It's a great question, Gordon, and it's obviously a really complex problem. As you've highlighted in the history of this issue, it's been going for many years, and there are many challenges with expanding a competition and expanding to a new state, even if that state has got a long history with AFL or playing Australian rules football. So in terms of looking at the strategic communications plan or a stakeholder engagement campaign around this issue to help build support for an AFL team in Tasmania and the expansion of the Australian Football League, there's a number of steps that I recommend you'd need to go through to build that campaign and to get that success. And this is the approach that we would use for basically any type of strategic communications or stakeholder engagement campaign that has a number of complex issues attached to it. And the first and most important thing you need to do is to identify who the decision makers are, because it's all very well doing a song and dance about what you think needs to happen, but if you're not influencing or if you're not changing the minds of the decision makers, then that song and dance will be for nothing. So you need to identify who those decision makers are, so that you will then know who to influence. And I think it's probably a good place to start. And I put this to you, Sabrine and Gordon. In this case, who do you think that the key decision makers are?
Well, I mean, straight off the bat, I'm thinking the obvious one would be the Tasmanian state government and the sports minister there. Then I'm thinking, obviously, the AFL and all the AFL clubs that need to come to consensus and basically come to vote and say, hey, yeah, we want this as part of our journey in the AFL. I'm thinking already the state league teams is ready, or the NAB League AFL teams that are already established there, and a whole bunch of local community stakeholders. And I'm thinking local footy clubs, fans.
So you've gone through a whole list of stakeholders that are really important to this issue, to the potential future of Tasmania having a state. but you've highlighted their stakeholders, some of whom are decision makers and some of whom are going to be useful in the campaign and really important players in the campaign. And I think if you were running this campaign, I think once you've got that full list that you've just gone through, is to then split the list out into two. So you've got people that you would involve in the campaign and involve in building public support and building key stakeholder support. But then you've got to highlight the handful that are actually the ones who are going to sign on the dotted line, the ones that we need to convince to accept this proposal to go ahead. And I think, the AFL, it's sitting with them really, the decision. And then I think you need to go even deeper than that to the AFL Commission. So ultimately, they'll be the ones deeply involved in signing off on this proposal, as are the club presidents. And Gordon, I think you've got some detail on the actual proceedings of how a vote and a decision will be made. But I think if we're highlighting who those decision makers are that we need to influence in this campaign, I'd be starting with the AFL Commission. So Goyder, McLaughlin, Bassett, Bishop, Milroy, Newbold, Trainer and Wilkie, the commissioners right now, they are almost the most important people in the room. We need to know who they are and what keeps them awake at night. And I know that's getting really, really personal, but I'm talking about what matters to them. And this is a classic approach in any type of influence management or stakeholder management. You need to know what keeps someone up at night. What's their pain? What's their problem that you're presenting a solution to? Because, and this is a mistake that a lot of organisations and leaders in campaigns make, is they think they're onto something good. They've got a really great proposal. It's a great song and dance about who they are and what they do. But if that's not talking to the pain and the problem and what matters to the person that you're talking to, then you're not going to get anywhere. So you need to do, and if I was running this campaign, I'd be suggesting to them, we need to know everything there is to know about those commissioners, those 8 commissioners, so that when we are making a proposal, we're pushing those pain points for them, we're talking their language, and we're presenting solutions to them that are going to be relevant to them and that are going to immediately capture their attention. And so that's probably I would go down to the nitty gritty of that detail. And if you're the one, if you've got your spokesperson for the campaign there meeting with the commissioners, it's about preparing a brief on the 8 commissioners and going into as much detail as possible. Otherwise, you might be presenting something that's directly relevant to you, but it's not directly relevant to them, the people that you're trying to influence. And I think it's those 8 commissioners, and then you've also got the department managers from the AFL, so the team of executive general managers from the AFL administration, who no doubt will be briefing the commissioners on the different aspects of this decision. And then you've got, I think, the club presidents. And Gordon, am I right in saying that the club presidents have a certain amount of vote or voting power on this decision?
Yeah, they do. So the way that the veto rules work is that the commission can come to their decision and then present the decision to the club presidents, and then that requires a 2/3 majority agreement to veto. So at the end of the day, the AFL only needs 7 of the 18 current presidents to agree to instate a new team for it to go ahead. Of course, all of the communications from Gil Mclaughlin and the wider executive at the AFL and the AFL Commission is that they want all the club presidents to agree. So I suppose one of the questions I have here is that how you would heat map the situation? Is it beyond just the key stakeholders and the key decision makers, that being the commission? But if they're so keen to bring everyone along with them, is it important to know why the AFL is doing that? And above and beyond that, is it then change who you are targeting in your communications?
I think absolutely it would change who you are targeting in your communications and what you're going to include, like what the key messages and content of those comms are going to be. And what I'm picturing in my mind, if any of our listeners have watched the US political drama, The West Wing, or any political drama for that matter, when there's a big vote coming up or they need to get a policy matter over the line, there's always that scene where they've got the whiteboard and you see that it's in the lead up to elections as well, and the same goes in Australia, and they'll have the whiteboard of all the people they've called that they've tried to influence. Are they sitting for? Are they sitting against? and you just need to chip away at that list until you've got everyone across in the 4 column. And it might be one of the horses for courses situations where you've got a different set of key messages, a different set of channels that you use for each of those decision makers. One thing that I'd be interested in exploring, it's probably a good question for you, Sabrine. Do you think there needs to be unanimous support for an AFL team in Tasmania? And in terms of the club presidents, it sounds like they don't need all of them to vote yes. But do you think it'd be wise in ensuring that it is unanimous before they proceed?
My instinct says no, and there's a reason why they don't need a lot of all the club presidents to say yes, and I'm assuming it's because they are going to get some naysayers that's going to be hard-nosed and say no. And I know off my one hand, I think I know the ones that will say yes, and those are the ones that have been threatened to be moved to Tasmania already. And as a North Melbourne supporter, I will vote yes for a Tasmanian team because I know that our club president's probably going to want to hand that off and never want to play ever again. But then I'm thinking that if it would be wise, but I just don't think it's achievable. I don't know, Gordo, do you think it's achievable?
I think group consensus is probably not going to be achievable given the history of the club presidents. I think it is more the AFL wanting a bit of a litmus test. I think Gil's coming to the end of his tenure, and he doesn't want to leave the AFL in a position where they're going to have a bunch of club presidents offside and cause headaches for the AFL in the future. So I think some of it is risk management from the AFL, making sure that they're making a fairly significant decision by bringing in a new club, and they don't want to lose the support of club presidents for further decisions in the future, especially around things like collective bargaining agreements, which are always the trickiest things to maintain. But yes, other than that, I think consensus has never really occurred. And even through the history where team mergers have occurred and relocations have happened before, they've usually been quite split down the lines of basically the club presidents and the club's own self-interest.
One key element to pull out of the stakeholder identification process, and we've just touched on it then, is that if you've mapped your stakeholders and you've mapped who they are, what decision-making power they've got, what their problems are, what their key interests and motivators are, then you can start to think about your key messages for them. In that process, you might, when you're doing the heat mapping, you might find that, yes, a lot of them are sitting on the fence and they're open to being influenced and hearing our key messages. Some might already be in support, and we just need to keep that support going, and we should use them. The tactic might therefore be use them as ambassadors for our campaign. But in the heat mapping process, you might find that there are some sitting all the way over on the other side who are so against Tasmania having an AFL team, and we might decide that, look, we're never going to win with them. We're never going to be influencing them to a point where they're going to be voting in favour of it. That's fine. In a lot of campaigns, that's going to be the case. You're going to have opponents that are so far gone, there's no point trying to influence them. But what you do need, if you've gone through that process and identified those couple of people, it's important to know then what narrative are they going to be using, because they're going to be influencing the key decision makers the same way as we're going to be. They're probably sitting around the same whiteboard thinking, okay, how are we going to win this vote and get in the way of this vote? So you need to, it's worthwhile at the start, before you get into the next steps of your strategy, in highlighting and thinking through what arguments are they going to use, what are going to be their key messages, because that will then influence the key messages that you use or the strategy that you use. It might be that you start thinking, okay, what are our counter narratives going to be? How can we use facts or evidence or a creative storytelling approach to counter some of the negative messages that we're going to find from our opponents? And the reason why that's so important to do at the start is because you can then be really efficient and effective in your response. So if they've started with an op-ed in the local paper in the Mercury down in Tasmania, you've already got your counter narrative ready to go. It's like putting water on a fire, or water onto a bin fire before it blows up into a bushfire. And that's one of the really effective sort of risk mitigation strategies that I would include at that initial stage.
Yeah, just to add to that, it doesn't mean that just because your heat map says that these naysayers are so far gone, it doesn't mean that you can bring them in closer to a more positive vote or a positive mindset after it's been established. We've worked with some of our clients before where we've turned or we've kind of reduced the negative mindset of some of the naysayers just by exposing them to positive engagement workshops, and then it's actually changed their mind, seeing things open up and develop firsthand. So it's with some positive and proactive, as James has said, definitely helped a strategy to bring those naysayers further to the middle, or even more so to the positive side. So, I mean, that's the beauty of strategic communications, right? And the beauty of the work that we do. A key message, or the right framed key message and correct stakeholder engagement, can really flip one's opinion.
And this goes to the third step of this process. So you've highlighted who the decision makers are, who your stakeholders are, where they sit on the heat map. You've done that exercise. You've figured out what their motivators are. Now you're starting to get into some of your key messages and what your narrative is going to be, whether it's counter narrative or it's positive storytelling. That's where you need to start building your key messages and building the evidence behind it. So do we need to do some modelling? Like, do we need to do some modelling on the positive financial impact of bringing a Tasmanian side down to the Apple Isle? Do we need to do some counter modelling on some of the points that we know our opponents are going to bring up about smaller population in Tasmania, larger population in other parts of Australia, the larger market size? Do we need to do some counter modelling on that? What's the evidence base that we can use? Can we start building some case studies of other AFL teams, or even looking beyond Australia to the rest of the world, and looking at how other big football leagues or sporting leagues have expanded, and the pros and cons, and figuring, are there any case studies that we can use in our campaign back here in Australia that's going to really support the cause? Because evidence, facts, modelling, case studies, those are the type of things that help get people over the line, because your stakeholders, the people that you're talking to, they want to be able to visualize what you're talking about. They want to be able to see the evidence case behind it. A lot of people nowadays are going to be naturally wary of storytelling and what they read in the media. Like, people are a little bit cautious than they used to be with what's being told and then the storylines that are being told on the news and in the paper. So you need to be able to back it in with that modelling and that evidence and those case studies, so people can believe it. They know that it's backed in by research. It's not just it's not just a gut feel. You think it's a good idea to have a Tasmanian AFL team. Okay, well, what's the evidence for it? And the case studies allow people to visualize what it could look like. And then they start to think, okay, that worked in that state, or that worked in that city on the other side of the world, and they did it. They dealt with some of the risks that way, and then it ended up being this boon for that country or that state. Now I can start to see how the same thing could happen for Tasmania. And so I think now you're getting into the nitty gritty of the strategy and the tactics and the key messaging that you can use as a part of your campaign.
And so once you've identified like the narrative shifts that need to occur and the kind of things you need to use to influence the key stakeholders, how do you, I suppose, present those facts in the best light possible? And is it important which types of mediums you use, or which type of techniques you use, or does that come on the back of after you've researched the stakeholders you need to address and the narratives you need to change?
Definitely comes on the back of the research that you've done about your stakeholders. So part of that research should highlight what are the best avenues for getting to that person. What's the most effective and efficient way of communicating your key message to them? And that's where we walk through the whole list of different tactics that you've got available. And that can be anything from direct meeting requests, so meeting with them one-on-one, through to the broader sort of information and education building, where you're putting Maybe you're writing an op-ed that's to be published through various newspapers. Maybe you start a social media campaign where you get some of those ambassadors of support. You start to get them telling the story as well. So that's not just coming from you, you're getting third-party validation. Maybe you're holding events or webinars or sessions where you can basically get your key messages across in as many different avenues as possible, but you've got to make sure that those are avenues that your key stakeholders are listening to. So, if we think back to those 8 commissioners that we spoke about at the start of this podcast, it's doing a little bit of research on who they are and what newspaper do they read. Do they read the AFR? Do they read the Australian? Do they read the Herald Sun or the Mercury? Or do they not read newspapers at all? Do they spend most of their time on Qantas flights? Like, do you need to be advertising in the Qantas lounge? Like, it's down to the little minutiae of making sure you get cut through. And often people think, I've just got to get my key message across in the biggest newspaper or the place that says it's got the most views. And people think, maybe that's the Herald Sun. But you've got to be a lot more targeted than that. You could get a lot more bang for your buck by figuring out exactly the mediums or the communication channels that your stakeholders that you're trying to influence, that they consume on a daily basis, and then using that particular medium. And it might be that you don't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars for a big ad in the Herald Sun. And News Corp might be disappointed at me for saying that, but there might be much more cost-efficient methods of getting through to those key stakeholders. And the one thing that I wouldn't rule out that a lot of people forget is that you can consider those direct meetings, the direct pitches. A lot of people are afraid to pick up the phone and go to the office manager of a key stakeholder or a commissioner or a politician. But you can literally reach out and ask for that meeting. And that might be, in some cases, that might be the most effective channel.
Moving on from, we've got that kind of 4-step process now fairly explained, to kind of dig into some hypotheticals that deal directly with the Tasmanian bid. And one was around strategy. And so the back and forth has been occurring in the media, but I'm sure also via direct channels, is this negotiation around a new stadium, which today has reportedly been confirmed to be held at Macquarie Point. Is it okay to have this win one, lose one approach? Because initially it felt like the state government was trying its hardest not to commit to new stadium when they already had multiple stadiums across various venues throughout the state. But obviously it seems now that as we come to the final bid being submitted today, they've agreed and made the hard commitment to this new venture. Is that okay for strategy to have this win one, lose one approach?
What we're seeing play out here is it's a classic form of bartering. Like, both sides have come at it with their wish list of what they'd like to have. I think what the AFL and the people running the AFL side of this negotiation have thought through is, okay, what do we want to get out of this selfishly, which, it's their job to do that. What do we want to put on the table, and then work back from there? What's the most that we can get out of it? And, they know that they're in a position of power here. They're the ones who have the ultimate decision, and they're the ones who Tasmania and others involved in the campaign to get a team in Tasmania, they want something from the AFL. So it's the AFL who are in a position of power here and have, are fully within their right to make certain demands. And I think that's what we're seeing play out.
The second question I have for you, Sab, is around timing. And so we see in a lot of these quite laborious decision-making processes, the media hams up or really emphasises the effect of timing, and especially when it happens to delays, which has also happened in this case. But how important is timing for these mass consensus change decisions? And not only is it expansion of clubs in the AFL, but we see it happens around the Republic referendum, around conscious votes, around any sort of large-scale a change process. Why is timing so important, or is timing that important?
When you're timing the announcement, or also even timing the submission for this, you want to make sure that all your key players or key stakeholders or decision makers that we've spoken about before have your full attention, honestly. So if we think about, for example, an election, you don't want to be asking for certain funding or pushing your priorities in front of a state government or federal government, when their main focus is something else. So if their main focus is the election, you're not and campaigning, you're not going to get in front of them or get your priorities in front of them to be thought of if you've put it in too late. So you need to make those things early. So that is talking about timing itself. You need to make sure that your timing is right so that it's in the lead up to whatever decision-making event is going to occur. So if we're going to talk about the state government, and if I was in advising the state government of Tasmania to submit, now would be the right time. You're ending the AFL season, it's about to come to a close. We're also seeing the AFLW season sort of kind of like pick up, and we're also seeing that AFLW North Melbourne Tasmanian team as a case study. So you can also just point to just local communities or local audiences to say, hey, look, why don't you come to an event? Why don't we go watch the AFLW game? Let's have a meeting in person and let's talk about this AFL Tasmanian team and see how we can get it up off the ground. Is that how you would approach it?
You're being a lot more strategic than I am, Sab. My approach to these kind of things is carpe diem. And why wait? We've got an opportunity now. Let's just go and do it. And the reason why I say that is because it might be a completely different landscape in 2 years' time, and you might not have the opportunity again. And when the door is open, I think you've got to take it. You've got to walk through it. And yes, you've got to do the proper planning around it. You've got to do the numbers around it. I appreciate that, but we've been doing that for 50 years. And I think a good example, it's different set of circumstances, obviously, but a couple of years ago when the AFL women's competition was started, Gil publicly came out and said there are a lot of people who said now's not the right time for AFLW. We don't have all the numbers there yet. We haven't done all the financials. It might be worth waiting until we've got more support and we can build it up slowly. And I'm pretty sure Mclaughlin has come out publicly and said, you know what, I said, no, let's do it. The time is now. Let's not wait. Let's not wait any longer. It's been asked for many years. And I think the Tasmanian AFL side, it's a whole lot of different circumstances, and this might just be revealing my true colours in my approach to strategy here, but I think just do it. You've got an open door. Don't wait. You've been doing modelling for years. We've had the case there for years. I think if you wait, you might risk other sports, like has already started with the Tasmanian basketball team. You'll have other sports that move in and you might miss your opportunity. So why wait any longer?
To kind of round out this conversation, I want to flip the perspective here and approach it from the AFL's point of view, because regardless of the outcome of this bid, change management and stakeholder management will need to occur. So if the decision is yes, then obviously there's conversations that will be held with the other 18 clubs, how it affects them, how it affects the executive of the AFL, how they go about integrating this new team, and how it affects their products, their TV ratings, their fixtures. Obviously, a lot of change will occur. And if the decision is no and there is no Tasmanian team, then how would you approach as the AFL negotiating with the state government of Tasmania and the Tasmanian people in general to keep them integrated and involved in the AFL as a sport, as a code and as a league?
A really good question, and one that I find it difficult to answer because I don't want this to be the case. But if you were Mclaughlin or the AFL and you decided for whatever reason that you had to say no, or the decision from the club presidents and the commissioners was no, we're not ready for it, then you go through the same process that we just outlined. If you were building the campaign in support, you need to highlight who are the key stakeholders, and some of them you've already mentioned there, Gordon, with the Tasmanian state government and Tasmanians more broadly, and then going through what are the pain points for them. I think we know right now what the pain point is. They don't have an AFL team. Okay, well, what solution can you provide to that? What counter narrative can you provide to that? And can you build a strategy or a narrative around what else you're going to offer them? What's the long-term future? What's the long-term story that you can provide? And I think that the answer to that long-term question is an important one. Both if the decision was not to have an AFL team, but also in thinking about the campaign for an AFL team, so many people and the decision makers that we're talking about will be focused on the immediate. Like, what's the immediate spend? What's the immediate financial impact? Because a lot of them, particularly for Mclaughlin and other members of the AFL Commission, their KPIs, their key performance indicators, will be based on the financials, the amount of people watching TV screens and then ad dollars they get from that. The commercial networks will get the ad dollars, and then the commercial networks pay for the TV rights that goes to the AFL. How many numbers are you getting through the turnstiles into the games? How many people are buying memberships? So it all goes back down to the financials. So I think you need to, if you're building a narrative for or against, you need to think through, how do we get through the initial financial impact? Because starting an AFL team would have a massive financial impact, as we've seen with when they started the Greater Western Sydney Giants in New South Wales and with the Gold Coast up in Queensland. There is a massive cash expenditure at the start. So what's the long-term picture that you can paint? Over time, are you going to see the financial return, because you're building a whole coalition of support and a whole new army of AFL supporters over generations? Families of Tasmanians that pass on their support of the Tasmanian Football Club through generations. Are you focusing on that long-term picture as opposed to the short-term expenditure? And I think a lot of problems that decision makers run into is that their KPIs are based on what turnover or what revenue are you going to bring in the next 12 months, as opposed to what are you going to bring in 20 years down the track? Because ultimately, you're not going to be the AFL commissioner in 20 years' time, are you? So why do you care what happens 20 years down the track? And I think that's a really important piece of this debate that's going to play out, whether Tasmania has a team or doesn't. Because if they don't have a team, then the AFL is going to have to think about, does that close the door on the future potential of an AFL team, and then the potential future growth of AFL in Tasmania? And are they suddenly going to miss out on many long-term dollars?
Well, that seems like a great place to round out this conversation. But given the sports nature of the discussion, all sports fans love a tip. So to close, I will ask you for your opinion on which way you reckon the bid submission will go. Will it be yes for the Tasmanian AFL licence, or will it be a no and more status quo for the rest of the league? Sab, you can lead us off.
My tip is yes. I think yes. They've waited long enough. Look, I think I'd love a fairy tale story for Tasmania. But also, as I said, I'm a North Melbourne fan, so I'm a bit biased. I want yes as well for a Tasmanian team. But noting that they've waited a long time, and there's a lot of homegrown talent there that want to stay in Tasmania and represent their home state. So I think the tip from me is going to be yes.
I think what we've seen play out recently will give you an indication. So we have seen elements of a campaign that we've discussed throughout the course of this podcast. You've seen articles throughout newspapers. You've seen different ambassadors of support who are standing up, like your Jack Rewalts and your Jonathan Browns. Like, it's clear that there's been a coordinated approach, and that's really ramped up more than it ever has been before. You've got branding, you've got a social media team, you've got a media team already for this Tasmanian team. And I think that shows that there has been a really coordinated approach. And I suspect that they have been behind closed doors also campaigning to those decision makers that we've been talking about throughout the course of this podcast. So I think the last hurdle then is arguably one of the most important people in this debate, and that's Gil Mclaughlin. Yes, he's only one vote on the AFL Commission, but what we've seen in the past or throughout his legacy is that he is clearly very influential, and he is clearly a very good operator behind the scenes. And I know there's a whole number of other people involved in this who no doubt have been just as influential. But what Gil has demonstrated on other issues like AFLW that we spoke of earlier in this podcast is that he knows how to work the room, he knows how to work the decision makers, and if he wants there to be an AFL If he wants there to be an AFL team in Tasmania, then there will be an AFL team in Tasmania. And I think he's coming to the end of his tenure, obviously, as at the AFL. And I reckon he'll be willing to burn a couple of bridges and to make a couple of big, bold decisions. This would be a big financial output, as I alluded to earlier. I reckon he's willing to take that on because he's not going to be the head in the future. But what he will get out of this is a long-term legacy. Like if Gil is the man that brings AFL to Tasmania, then that is something that people will remember in 50 years' time. And we go back, at the start of this podcast, we said, what are the key motivators for people? What are the key drivers for the decision makers involved? Well, I think legacy is always a really important one. It's something that we all think about naturally as human beings. We want that to be a legacy. I think Gil's in a position now to build a legacy for 50, 100 years' time into the future, and he's in the position where he can make some bold calls and help get this over the line. So based on that, I think we're going to see an AFL team in Tasmania very shortly.
There we have it. Lots of good news for our Tasmanian listeners and for football fans in general. Thank you very much for joining us today, James and Sabrine, and thank you for your time. And thank you to everyone who has been listening. But I will say, before you start planning your grand final parties, make sure you subscribe to Michelson Alexander Explains on your podcast player of choice or on our YouTube channel. And if you have a theme or a topic you'd like us to roundtable like we have today for future episodes, let us know by leaving a comment or a review. And until next time, enjoy the football.